Hi there. So now we're going to start talking about connections. We have analyzed the components of the system. You have looked at is the list of the components that you need in your system, and you have analyzed each one of them, finding out the needs and the products or inputs and outputs, or you can call it in a different way. But before we start making connections, let's think about what happens when the connections don't happen. Waste. That's one of the first things that we create when we don't have design. The concept of waste was created to justify our inability to think systemically. When products are not accounted for, they become pollutants. A pollutant is any output of any component that is not being used productively by any other. Have you ever thought about it in that way? What happens in your house when a resource is not being used? When your house, one of the products of your house is not being used, in, for example, the gray water that it comes from your sink or from the shower, where does it go to? Is that a resource to something else? Or you don't know? Or is it just pollution into the ocean? This is the difference between being efficient and being inefficient. On the other side of this coin that we're looking at, work. Work is another thing that we invented to justify our inability to design well. Work is a result of an input not provided by another component of the system. That is why we need good design to eliminate pollution and extra work. In other words, permaculture is your path to live a life without waste and with time to do the things that you really want to be doing. Permaculture is lifestyle by design. We know now that to enable a component to function, we must put it in the right place. This may be enough for a living component, such as ducks, for example. If you put ducks in a swampy area or in a wet spot with permanent water available, they might look after themselves and they will change the environment around them to suit their needs. Ducks are more adaptable to wet zones than chickens. In fact, in Ecocentric Pack, we always use ducks. We used to have ducks around the areas that we wanted to dig ponds, because this is what ducks do. They make their own ponds. So when instead of us digging ponds, what we did was using the work of the ducks to create ponds like that. We put the ducks in a certain area that we wanted to dig a pond. We start running water slightly over the area, and ponds would follow this water, digging shallow ponds wherever they went, and that would create a natural path for the water to follow. All we had to do after that was deepening up those ponds, and we had a duck pond ready to go. Then we could establish everything around it. But ducks are very unique components. They're not like every other ones. Some of them you will have to think about how, when, and where you're going to introduce them into your system. There has to be an arrangement. You have to arrange connections with other elements. Let's have a look a little bit more about that. We have analyzed the chicken, and we've seen that the chicken has certain yields and certain needs or inputs and outputs. The connection between the chicken and the other elements will be made if we find another component that needs those outputs of the chicken. And if there is another component in the plan that provides and offers the inputs that the chicken needs. Making connections can be done by answering some questions. You can look at one of the components and ask, of what use are the products of this particular component? And how can they supply the needs of another? What needs of this component can be supplied by another? Where is this component incompatible with another? Be careful not to impose limitations on your thought processes. For instance, you will see that chickens can be connected to your house. Can you imagine the chickens living connected to your home? Maybe not in your climate, in your culture. But don't forget that the world has many cultures, and a little bit of knowledge about how other cultures use the same components in their design might be very useful. You can ask, where does this component benefit other parts of the system? Your answers will provide a plan of relative placement. That's what it's called, the relative placement. It's a description about the relationship between components. It can sound like this. The house needs food and fuel and for cooking and other needs. It gives shelter from the weather and warmth for people. It also produces food scraps and grey water. We can see the possible connections with the chicken. Some tropical cultures have chickens under their house to control pests and snakes. Others have the chicken not too far away to avoid the dust and the smells that the chicken may bring. Your local climate plays an important part in the placement of components too. The food forest needs pest control. Weeding and manure are needs of the food forest, and also it's very similar to the veggie garden. It needs heat and it needs water. It gives food for people and food for different animals, including the chicken. We can see that chickens and food forests are almost a natural match. We just have to put them together. The veggie garden is similar to the food forest in products and in needs, with different species that you are going to select. And they also have an extra need of maintenance. Veggie gardens usually have a lot more annual species, which means you have to visit them more often. Some of that maintenance includes weeding, pest control, and scratching. And remember, these are important products or behaviors of the chicken. The chickens like to scratch the surface of the soil. They are excellent in pest control. They eat insects. They select weed seeds, and they can do that much better than any human can do. The pond also needs some manure and yields fish and water plants as food. And it reflects the light as it absorbs heat. So we can see the many components just in this small selection here. Many components provide the needs and accept the products of others. And we see the problem of many small traditional farms here. All the components are there. I mean, we see veggie gardens and food forests and ponds and houses and chickens in a farm. But nothing seems to be connected to anything. This means that a traditional farm or an industrial farm in the modern days does not enjoy the many benefits of the relative placement, of putting things in relationship with each other on space. In other words, we could say that in traditional and industrial farms, nature is restrained. It's the same paradigm that we have for a long time, when we used to think that we need to control nature and not adapt to it. Permaculture offers you a way of thinking about the same things, the same elements, in a different way, by integrating them, by placing them in relationship with each other. In the next exercise, you are going to practice the concept of relative placement. You're going to make a small system like this one and try to add a few of these connections. Products become needs of another element. You can see that the reflected light of the pond, for example, is a necessity of fruit to ripen. So maybe we can position the pond and the forest in the way that fruit will ripen a little bit earlier in the season. Can you think about the value that is if you have early ripe fruit in season? So do the next exercise without inventing anything new. You can redesign the existing components of a small farm to make it possible for each to serve others. Just by moving some components into a beneficial design assembly, we can ensure that the chicken, the veggie garden, the food forest, the pond, and the house are in the right place in relationship with each other. After these connections are made, in a conceptual way, we can start thinking about the land and where are we going to put each one of these elements based on our analysis that we have done so far. So it is a good moment now to do a review of the entire course back to where you are. Watch the classes that you haven't seen yet, do the exercises that you haven't done yet, and let's catch up until the next phase when we start placing elements on the land. I'll see you on the next class.